His name was Mikhail Ilyich Koshkin, born in 1,898 inches, a small village near Yaroslavl, about 100 kilometers north of Moscow. His father was a watchmaker, meticulous, precise, a man who could see the invisible mechanisms that made the world move. From an early age, Mikhail inherited that same gift. He could look at any broken device and instantly picture how it was meant to work, how each part fit together, where energy was lost, where motion could be saved. By the early 1930 seconds, Koshkin had risen to become chief engineer at the Kharkov locomotive plant, a vast industrial complex that built locomotives and, increasingly, tanks for the Red Army. He was a man of quiet intensity, thin, focused, with dark eyes that seemed to burn from within. He smoked constantly and worked 16-hour days, rarely stopping to rest or eat. At that time, the Soviet Union was focused on one thing above all: mechanized strength. Tanks were seen as the future of warfare, symbols of modern power and progress. But there was a problem. Most of the tanks in production were unreliable. They were slow, under-armored, and prone to breakdowns in harsh conditions. Engines stalled in the freezing cold, transmissions locked up, crews struggled to survive long winter operations. Compared to what other nations were building, Soviet tanks were falling behind. Koshkin understood this, and he wasn't afraid to say it. At a time when speaking out could cost a person everything, he argued that the old designs were outdated. He believed that to move forward, they needed to start from scratch, to build a completely new kind of tank that could match the best in the world. It was a daring idea, and it could have ended his career. But instead, his determination was noticed. The army saw in him something rare: courage matched with genius. By 1938, Koshkin was leading a small, determined team of engineers in Kharkov. Their mission was simple to describe, but nearly impossible to achieve: design the best tank in the world. He gathered brilliant mind specialists like Alexander Morozov, who understood engines like a poet understands words, and Nikolai Tashchin, an expert in armor design. Together, they studied every tank they could find, dismantling old models, analyzing foreign machines, and learning from every success and failure. And somewhere in that process, Koshkin saw something new, an insight that would soon change the course of tank design forever. It's hard to imagine that kind of courage in those days. To speak truth to power in Stalinist Russia was to risk everything. Yet Koshkin was protected by something that many engineers weren't. He was brilliant. The Red Army needed brilliant men, even if Stalin didn't always trust them. And somewhere, someone in the military hierarchy decided that Koshkin's boldness was the kind of boldness they needed. By 1938, Koshkin was leading a team of engineers at the Kharkiv Locomotive Works. His mandate was simple and terrifying: design the best tank in the world. No pressure. Koshkin threw himself into the work with an intensity that bordered on mania. He assembled By 1939, war was coming. Everyone could feel it. Hitler was rattling his saber. The Soviet Union was making noises about invading Poland. The clock was ticking, and Koshkin knew it. The army commissioned him to build a tank. Not several prototypes to choose from. Not a development program. A tank. Singular. Singular and ready within 18 months. It was, on its face, impossible. No tank had ever been designed, prototyped, tested, and approved in such a short time frame. It required weeks of meetings just to approve the specifications, months of engineering work, then testing, then modification, then more testing. Koshkin agreed to do it in 18 months. The pressure began building immediately. This wasn't like academic design work. This was the kind of pressure where a single mistake could cost everyone in the room their lives. In Stalinist Russia, failure wasn't just professional disgrace, it was death. If the tank was late, Koshkin would be executed for sabotage. If the tank was weak, he would be executed for treason. If the tank was too expensive, he would be executed for wasting Soviet resources. The only option was to succeed. His team worked through the winter of 1,939 40 inches, an unheated factory in Kharkiv. The temperature dropped to -20 degrees Celsius some nights. Men worked in their overcoats and gloves, their fingers so cold they could barely grip tools. Some of them developed frostbite. One of the younger engineers, a brilliant kid named Dmitry, who was only 23 years old, had to be hospitalized with pneumonia. He recovered, but it took 3 weeks. There were other pressures too. Spies. Stalin's secret police were everywhere. watching for signs of sabotage or disloyalty. Engineers had to be careful about what they said, even to each other. A joke about the party could get you arrested. Criticism of the design could be interpreted as disloyalty to the state. Koshkin walked a tightrope every single day, keeping his team motivated while also being careful not to say anything that could be misinterpreted by the GPU watchers. And then there were the technical failures. So many failures. The transmission kept breaking. The cooling system couldn't handle the heat from the new, more powerful diesel engine. The gun mounting was unstable at high speed. The crew compartment was so tight that the loader couldn't properly load shells. One prototype caught fire during testing. Another turned over on its side during a high-speed turn. A third simply stopped working and had to be towed back to the factory, where engineers spent 3 weeks figuring out what had gone wrong. By late 1940, Koshkin was running on cigarettes, black coffee, and what seemed like pure spite. He'd lost weight. His eyes had that hollow, haunted look of a man who hasn't slept properly in months. His team was exhausted, demoralized, running on fumes. And then everything changed. Germany invaded the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. Suddenly, the design they'd been working on wasn't some theoretical future tank, it was the only hope between the Soviet Union and annihilation. The first German Panzers that attacked the Soviet Union weren't the newest models. They were mostly Panzer IIIs and IVs, with a few of the heavier Tigers in the mix, and Soviet tanks broke down against them like toys. The armor was too thin, the guns were too weak. Soviet tankers were dying by the hundreds. The news from the front was catastrophic. The Wehrmacht was advancing at impossible speed. Villages were falling daily. Entire Soviet divisions were being surrounded and destroyed. And in the middle of all this chaos and terror, Koshkin had to deliver. The first T-34 prototype was being prepared for final testing. It wasn't perfect, there were still problems, but it was going to be tested anyway, because the army needed tanks now. There was no time for careful, methodical development. The country was burning, and they needed weapons. On a cold day in September 1941, the test driver, a brave man named Alexei who'd volunteered for the job, climbed into the hull and started the engine. The sound was different from other Soviet tanks, more powerful, more confident somehow. Then Alexei put the T-34 into gear and drove. It moved with a speed and fluidity that no Soviet tank had ever demonstrated. The suspension, which Koshkin's engineers had spent months perfecting, absorbed bumps and obstacles like the tank was floating. The driver's compartment was actually spacious enough to maneuver. The gun, a 45mm that seemed almost delicate compared to the weight of the machine, swiveled smoothly, tracking targets with precision. For 6 hours, Alexei drove. He pushed the tank to its limits and beyond. He did high-speed turns. He climbed steep slopes. He drove through mud and snow and rocky terrain. And the T-34 responded to every command. Smooth and obedient, like a dancer responding to music. When Alexei finally climbed out, he was grinning. He walked straight to Koshkin and said something that has been repeated in military histories ever since. The Germans can't build anything like this. He was right. They couldn't. Not yet. But there was still a problem. Koshkin had delivered the tank, but he was dying. The stress of the past 3 years had broken something inside him. He'd developed a lung infection that wouldn't go away. Something that the factory doctors called chronic bronchitis, but which was almost certainly tuberculosis. By late 1941, he was coughing blood into handkerchiefs he tried to hide from his colleagues. His weight had dropped to skeletal levels. He looked like a ghost haunting his own factory. The army offered him rest, a chance to recover. He refused. There was still work to do. The first T-34 had been successfully tested, but there were problems to solve. The transmission needed modification. The internal communication system wasn't working properly. The ammunition storage was inefficient. There were 100 small things that could be improved, and Koshkin couldn't rest, knowing they remained unfixed. By December 1941, the situation at the front had become even more desperate. The Germans had laid siege to Moscow. It looked like the Soviet Union might actually lose. In this atmosphere of existential terror, the T-34 became something close to a lifeline. The Red Army needed these tanks. They needed them in massive numbers, and they needed them now. Koshkin made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He would drive to the front himself to observe the T-34 inches combat. He would see what worked, and what didn't. He would gather data that could be used to improve the design, and then he would drive back, fix the problems, and ensure that every T-34 rolling off the assembly line was the best possible version. It was a decision that no one in his position would have made. He was the chief designer. He wasn't supposed to expose himself to danger. He was supposed to stay in the factory and work, but Koshkin had never been good at following the rules that made sense only on paper. He needed to see his creation in action. He needed to understand how it performed against actual German tanks. In early January 1942, Koshkin climbed into a T-34 alongside a military liaison officer and drove toward the front near Moscow. The journey took him through a landscape of devastation. Villages had been burned. Bodies lay frozen in the snow. Soviet soldiers, German soldiers, civilians caught in the crossfire. The roads were clogged with military traffic. Soviet troops were trying to launch a counteroffensive against the Germans, and every tank, every truck, every soldier was heading east toward the sound of the guns. When Koshkin finally reached the front lines, he was struck by how different reality was from his carefully controlled factory tests. The T-34 seconds he saw were covered in mud and snow, their crews operating them near the edge of exhaustion. Some were damaged, showing the scars of combat. One had a hole punched through the whole German anti-tank fire that the armor hadn't stopped, but the crew had survived because the sloped armor had deflected enough of the impact that the shell hadn't fully penetrated. Koshkin spent 3 days observing. He interviewed tank commanders. He asked about problems they'd encountered. He took notes in a small notebook he carried, his hands shaking with cold and illness. What he learned was both encouraging and troubling. The T-34's armor was indeed performing as designed. German standard anti-tank guns couldn't reliably penetrate it. Tank crews loved the speed and maneuverability. But there were problems too. The radio systems didn't work properly, so tank commanders couldn't communicate with each other. The gun's sight was inadequate for long-range targeting. The ammunition storage was indeed inefficient. Shells were getting stuck during rapid fire. More worryingly, Koshkin noticed something that would haunt him. Some of the tank crews were inexperienced, poorly trained. They were throwing away their advantage through tactics that were suicidal. He watched one T-34 charge directly at a German anti-tank gun position, moving in a straight line. Even the superior armor couldn't save it against concentrated fire at point-blank range. On his 3rd day at the front, Koshkin collapsed. His lung infection, exacerbated by the cold and stress, overwhelmed him. One moment, he was standing in a forward observation post, watching a tank battle. The next moment, everything went black, and he was waking up in a Soviet field hospital with orderlies trying to get him to rest. His condition was immediately diagnosed as serious. The Soviet military doctor told him plainly, if he didn't get proper rest, he would die. The infection had spread to both lungs. His fever was dangerously high. He needed to get back to a proper hospital in Moscow or Kharkov, get medical treatment, get rest. Koshkin refused again. He got up out of the hospital bed after only 2 days. He was weak, fevered, coughing constantly. But he insisted on being driven back to the factory. There was work to do. The T-34 had proven itself in combat, but it could be better, and Koshkin was the only person who could make those improvements. The drive back to Kharkiv through the frozen Russian winter was something that should have killed him. The roads were terrible, choked with military traffic, and frozen solid in places. Every bump sent pain shooting through Koshkin's chest. He was coughing up blood regularly now, the handkerchief constantly stained red. He had a fever so high that at times he was delirious, seeing things that weren't there, forgetting where he was. By the time he reached the factory in Kharkiv, it was clear to everyone that he was dying. His subordinates wanted to send him home, to let him rest. The factory doctors were appalled at his condition, but Koshkin refused to stop working. He'd established a small office near the main design section, and he spent every day there, working through the problems he'd identified at the front. Radio systems. He redesigned the communication network so that T-34 seconds could talk to each other more reliably. It was a small thing, but it would have enormous tactical implications. Tank commanders who could communicate with each other could coordinate their attacks, support each other in battle, pull back when necessary, instead of fighting to the death. Ammunition. Storage. He worked with his ammunition specialists to redesign the shell racks, creating a storage system that allowed faster, more reliable loading without shells getting jammed. The gun sight. This was more complex. the current site wasn't adequate for long-range engagements. Koshkin sketched new designs, worked with the optical specialists, pushed for improvements that would make the T-34 an even more formidable weapon. He worked through January, February, and into March of 1942. Winter was giving way to spring. Snow was melting, revealing the brown, dead landscape beneath. And Mikhail Koshkin, the man who had designed the tank that changed the war, was fading away like the snow. By mid-March, he could barely get out of bed. His weight had dropped to 80 pounds. His hair had turned almost white. The infection had destroyed his lungs. Every breath was a struggle, a wet, rattling sound that terrified everyone who heard it. On March 26, 1942, surrounded by some of his closest colleagues and a few military officers who'd come to pay their respects, Mikhail Ilyich Koshkin died. He was 43 years old. He'd spent 3 years designing the T-34 and barely 2 months observing it in combat before tuberculosis claimed him. His funeral was quiet and brief. There were no state ceremonies. Koshkin hadn't been important enough for that, despite what he'd accomplished. Just a few people gathered in a cemetery in Kharkov while the spring rain fell, and they buried the man who had changed the course of the war. Most of the people at that funeral believed that Koshkin's work was done. The T-34 would outlive its designer by more than 40 years. Production would continue into the 1950 seconds. Variants of the design would be used by dozens of countries. Soviet tank doctrine, which was still figuring itself out in 1942, would evolve around the capabilities of the T-34. And the German army, faced with this machine that their weapons couldn't reliably penetrate, would be forced into a technological race that they would ultimately lose. But at Koshkin's funeral, on that grey spring day in Kharkiv, nobody could have predicted that. They only knew that a brilliant man was gone, and the T-34 remained. When the first German tank crews encountered the T-34's serious numbers, something very close to panic spread through the Wehrmacht. This wasn't fear of an unknown weapon. It was fear of encountering something for which the military had no answer. And worst of all, this something had already been in production for months, before anyone in Berlin even knew it was a serious threat. The reports came back from the Eastern Front with increasing urgency. A standard German Panzer III hitting a T-34 head-on couldn't penetrate the armor. Anti-tank guns that had been effective against Soviet tanks were useless against this new machine, and the T-34, conversely, could destroy German tanks from ranges where the German shells couldn't even reach. In April 1942, a German officer sent a detailed report back to Berlin, analyzing the T-34. His conclusions were stark. "We have nothing that can reliably stop this tank at any practical combat distance." The phrase that would become famous was attributed to German General Paul Ludwig Eberhardt. The T-34 is the best tank in the world. But what made this truly terrifying to German command wasn't just that the T-34 was good, it was that the Soviets were building them by the thousands. Soviet tank production was ramping up. Factory after factory was churning them out. Soviet industry, despite the vast destruction wrought by the German invasion, was actually increasing weapons production, not decreasing it. This was the opposite of what German military planners had expected. They'd assumed that invading the Soviet Union would quickly destroy Soviet industrial capacity. Instead, factories had been evacuated east, beyond German reach, and were now producing tanks at a rate that made German production look weak. The German response was immediate but not particularly creative. They decided to build bigger, more powerful tanks. The Tiger I, which had been in development, was rushed into production. It was a monster, 62 tons of steel, thick armor that could withstand most Soviet guns, armed with a powerful 88mm gun that could outrange the T-34's 45mm weapon. The problem was that there weren't very many Tigers. They were expensive to produce, complex to manufacture, and breaking down them required specialist mechanics and parts that were in short supply. And the T-34 kept coming and coming and coming, wave after wave of them, overwhelming through sheer numbers what Germany couldn't overcome through superior technology. By 1943, the tank war on the Eastern Front had become a grinding contest of attrition. The Soviets would produce 3 T-34 seconds for every Tiger the Germans built. The Soviets could afford to lose tanks. They had manpower. The German military establishment understood this. There were reports written after the war during the war crimes trials, where German officers reflected on the T-34 and how it had changed everything. One report stated bluntly, "Had the T-34 not existed, the war in the East would have lasted perhaps another 2 years longer. The psychological effect on our troops of facing this machine was devastating." But let me push deeper into this, because the real story isn't just about tanks fighting tanks. It's about what happens when military institutions are forced to confront the reality that their old ways don't work anymore. By mid-1943, the T-34 had been in combat for more than 18 months. In that time, it had destroyed an estimated 18,000 German tanks, tank destroyers, and self-propelled guns. 18,000. That's not an exaggeration or propaganda figure that's based on production records and German loss estimates. Think about what that number means. Every German tank lost to Soviet anti-tank fire, to tank versus tank combat, to mines and hidden obstacles. Thousands and thousands of them died to the T-34. German crews learned to fear this machine with an intensity that went beyond normal military fear. There were cases where German units, upon spotting T-34 seconds, would simply retreat without engaging. The psychological impact was enormous. Meanwhile, the T-34 was evolving. The original version had a 45mm gun that was adequate for 1,941 and 1,942. But as German armor improved, this gun became less and less effective. In 1943, a new version appeared, the T-34-85. It mounted an 85mm gun, the same gun that would later be used on Soviet heavy tanks. Suddenly, the T-34 could threaten German heavy tanks at ranges where German medium tank guns couldn't threaten it back. The implications were stunning. A Soviet tanker commanding a T-34-85 had a significant advantage over a German Panther or even a Tiger in many tactical situations. Not because the tank was more heavily armored, it wasn't, but because the gun was more powerful, and because the sloped armor was still as effective as it had been against weaker guns. This led to another round of German design work. The Panther was redesigned with sloped armor, borrowing heavily from what the Germans had learned from studying captured T-34 seconds. The Tiger II was built even more heavily, with even thicker sloped armor. The Germans were essentially playing catch-up to a design that had been finalized in 1940 and first produced in 1941. What's fascinating from a design perspective is that the Germans, despite having superior optical technology, better welding techniques, and access to better steel in many cases, couldn't quite match what the tank that Mikhail Koshkin had designed, using techniques that seemed radical in 1940, had become the foundation of Soviet victory, not through revolutionary tactics or genius strategy, but through the simple mathematics of production. Because the T-34 was relatively cheap to build and relatively easy to manufacture, Soviet industry could produce them in massive numbers. And because those tanks were individually competitive with their German counterparts, and superior in many tactical situations, that numerical advantage translated into military dominance. What's remarkable is that the T-34's influence didn't stop when the war ended. In fact, in many ways, it just began. After the Second World War, the Soviet Union became increasingly focused on tank design and tank doctrine as the foundation of its military power. Weak in aircraft, lacking a navy that could match NATO, the Soviets compensated by building the best land army they could, and the foundation of that army was tanks. Soviet tank doctrine in the Cold War era was built entirely around the legacy of the T-34. Soviet designers took the lessons from the T-34 and pushed them further. The T-44, which came immediately after the war, refined the design. Then the T-54, which became the most produced tank in history, was a direct descendant of T-34 design philosophy. The T-55, the T-62, the T-72, all of these tanks carried forward the principles that Mikhail Koshkin had established: sloped armor, compact profile, powerful engine, reliable production. Meanwhile, the T-34 itself didn't disappear when the war ended. It was too good to just be retired. Soviet factories continued producing variants of it into the 1,950 seconds. Soviet allies received T-34 seconds as military aid. By the Korean War in 1950 to 53, T-34 seconds were the main Soviet tank in combat, and they shocked American commanders who weren't fully prepared for them. American tankers had expected inferior Soviet tanks. Instead, they faced machines that, while not as advanced as the newest American Pershings and Pattons, were still formidable opponents. Even more remarkably, the T-34 saw service in conflicts throughout the Cold War and beyond. Variations of it were used by communist forces in Vietnam. It appeared in Middle Eastern conflicts between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Hungarian revolutionaries used captured T-34 seconds in 1956 against Soviet forces. North Vietnamese forces used them. They were still being used by small nations into the 1960 seconds and even beyond. The Korean conflict is particularly instructive. American military planners had been caught off guard by the quality of Soviet tanks that had been provided to North Korea. The American M-26 Pershing tank, which was only just being introduced into service, had to be rushed into production in greater numbers to compete. The T-34-85, which was still the main tank that North Korean and Soviet forces were using, was effective enough to cause American commanders serious concerns. American tankers who had expected to have a monopoly on tank superiority suddenly found themselves in desperate, close-range tank duels with machines that could match their own. In a very real sense, the Cold War's entire tank development program was driven by the existence of the T-34 and its successors. The United States would go on to build the M48 Patton, the M60, and finally, the M1 Abrams. Germany would build the Leopard. Britain would build the Chieftain and Challenger. All of these tanks were, in part, responses to the challenge posed by Soviet tank design, which was itself rooted in the innovations that Mikhail Koshkin had pioneered in the T-34. Military historians have estimated that the T-34's design principles influenced almost every tank design that came after it, on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The sloped armor that had seemed so revolutionary in 1941 had become standard. The compact, powerful design had become the template. The emphasis on reliability over complexity had influenced Soviet doctrine, which even today emphasizes simpler, more robust designs over complex ones. When you look at modern tanks, the Leopard 2, the Challenger 2, the Abrams, you can see echoes of the T-34's influence. The emphasis on sloped armor for better protection without increasing weight. The balanced design that doesn't sacrifice firepower or protection or mobility for one of them. The understanding that a tank is a system, not just an assembly of components. None of this would have happened without Mikhail Koshkin and the team of engineers who worked with him. They didn't invent tank design, but they fundamentally changed how tanks were designed. They took existing principles. Sloped armor had been discussed before, diesel engines were known, torsion bar suspension existed, and combined them in a way that was revolutionary. They created a tank that was more than the sum of its parts. But let's return to Mikhail Koshkin for a moment. Let's return to the man himself, because the technological story, while fascinating, isn't complete without understanding the human story. Koshkin never knew that his tank would become this legendary. He never saw a T-34 inches combat. He never witnessed the panic it caused German tankers. He never saw the evolution of Soviet tank design that his work enabled. He died in 1942, believing that his job was done, not understanding that the real impact of his life's work was just beginning. What would Koshkin have thought if he could have somehow seen the future? If he could have known that his tank would inspire German designers to rethink everything they knew about armor? If he could have known that the T-34 would spawn an entire line of successors that would define Soviet military power for decades? If he could have known that his sloped armor would be the standard for tank design, even in the 21st century? There's something deeply human about that gap between the creator and the consequence of the creation. Koshkin worked himself to death to build a machine. He never got to see what that machine would become. He never got to see the millions of soldiers, Soviet, German, American, British, French, Chinese, Israeli, Egyptian, who would ride in tanks descended from his design. He never got to see the Cold War that his work, in many ways, helped shape. After Koshkin died, his name largely disappeared from Soviet propaganda and public consciousness. The tank was important, but the man who designed it wasn't celebrated the way German industrialists like Ferdinand Porsche were celebrated for their tank designs. This was partly because Koshkin had died and wasn't available to be a public figure. It was partly because Soviet propaganda didn't always emphasize individual achievement. The emphasis was on the collective, on the Soviet people and the Soviet system, not on individual geniuses. But Koshkin had achieved something profound. He had created something that changed the world. The T-34 wasn't the best tank in every possible measure, but it was good enough, and it was available in sufficient numbers, and that combination was more powerful than any amount of individual superiority could have been. In some ways, Koshkin's life echoes the larger pattern of the Second World War. So many of the key figures, the engineers, the scientists, the strategists, were driven by the crisis of the moment. They didn't have time to think about their legacy or their place in history. They only had time to focus on the immediate problem, building something that would save their nation, their army, their people. And yet, in solving those immediate problems, they created legacies that would extend far beyond their own lifetimes. Koshkin is remembered now, at least in military history circles. His name is associated with the T-34. Historians credit him with revolutionizing tank design, but it's a quiet kind of remembrance. He doesn't have statues in every city the way some generals do. He's not a household name. Most people don't know who designed the most important tank of the Second World War, but perhaps that's fitting. The T-34 wasn't about Koshkin's ego or his personal glory. It was about solving a problem. It was about creating something that worked, that could be produced in sufficient numbers, and that would give his country, his people, a fighting chance. That he accomplished all three of these things, despite the incredible pressure, the political danger, the technical obstacles, and ultimately his own failing health, is remarkable enough. As we close this story, as we think about the T-34 and what it meant, we have to ask, what is the lesson here? What is the thing that makes the T-34 truly unthinkable, truly revolutionary? It wasn't the armor, not really. Armor was armor. It was effective because of the angle, but other factors contributed too. It was a combination of everything. The armor, the engine, the transmission, the gun, the overall design, the production numbers, the doctrine, the training. The T-34 won not because one element was revolutionary, but because all elements were working together in a way that previous tank designs hadn't achieved. And the real innovation, the truly unthinkable innovation, was understanding that a tank isn't about being the best tank. It's about being good enough in most ways, excellent in a few ways, and producible in sufficient numbers. The Germans built better tanks in many measures, but they couldn't build enough of them. The Soviets built a tank that was good across the board and could be produced by the thousands. That's what won.